A note on language. The term celestial is used in both primary and older secondary sources. It originates from an old name for the Chinese Empire, the Celestial Empire. The term is not common in modern day, but was widely used in both the 19th and early 20th century. It will be used occasionally throughout the episode when citing primary sources. It was the year 1856. The Crimean War had ended with the Treaty of Paris. The famous writer Oscar Wilde was born, and James Buchanan was elected the 15th President of the United States. In California, the gold rush had been over for nearly a year. But further north, on the banks of the mighty Fraser River, the future of British Columbia would be cemented in history with the first discovery of gold. James Douglas, the then governor of the Vancouver Island colony, as well as the head of the Hudson's Bay Company, made sure to keep this early discovery a secret. The area was mined for nearly 2 years, and by 1858 they had nearly 800 ounces of the precious ore. Needing for the raw material to be refined, the gold was promptly shipped to California. It was an early spring morning of the same year when the first news of gold in the Fraser River would break. A Washington state newspaper headline read, "Late and important from Victoria. Gold discovery confirmed. Rich gold fields found on the Frasers and Thompsons rivers. Miners making from $8 to $50 a day." The secret was out. Almost overnight, thousands of men would catch the so-called gold fever, and Douglas, worried of the lawlessness and unrest that had been seen in other gold fields, began instituting permits for miners. Britain declared that the mainland would become a new colony of British Columbia in 1858, with James Douglas once more the governor. Among the thousands of miners who traveled to BC in search of wealth were many Chinese men who came looking to make their own fortunes as well. Most Chinese immigrants hailed from one of the 4 main districts in the Pearl River Delta of the Guangdong province. Many factors drove these men to seek wealth elsewhere, with population growth, rural poverty, and political upheaval being key factors. There was also cultural traditions of seeking opportunities overseas and sending money home to support families in hopes of an eventual return. The passage to North America was not cheap though, and due to this, the large majority of Chinese immigrants were young, single men. Though the idea was to eventually return home to China, many men would never see their homeland again. Kamloops itself had its own gold rush, with gold first being discovered in the Tranquille River, a tributary of the Thompson River, in 1858. As with the rest of the new colony, hundreds poured into the area searching for gold. Starting in the late 1850s, an estimated 200 to 300 Chinese men traveled up the river to Kamloops, where they struck claims alongside white and indigenous men. The Tranquille gold rush was smaller than some of the more trodden areas like Yale or Hope, which would see thousands of men. Though it isn't to say no money was to be made in Tranquille, it is said that some of the men were making over $4 a day, which in modern time is around $140. The Fraser Gold Rush was short-lived, collapsing only after a few years. Many prospectors, including Chinese men, moved north following the Caribou Gold Rush, though some stayed to continue to work their claims. Of the Chinese men who stayed, many worked as houseboys or cooks for the Hudson's Bay Company, with a few opening small businesses like laundries and general stores. Ah Loy was one of these men, working as both a houseboy and cook before returning to China for some time. He was reportedly quite well liked, and his leaving was bemoaned by the Hudson's Bay Company men he worked for. Ah Loy would eventually return to Kamloops and open a general store in town. The largest influx of Chinese workers, though, was not brought in because of the gold rush, but due to the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. As mentioned in the last episode, one of the promises Canada made to BC to have them join the Confederation was a transcontinental railway that would connect BC to the eastern side of the country. The clock was ticking on this promise, and in 1881, the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR, was incorporated. Surveyors had traveled throughout BC mapping the best routes, including through newly treated lands as well as unceded traditional territories. With the route chosen, the building was started. Andrew Onderdonk was an American contractor who won the bid for a section of the CPR, from Port Moody up to the edges of Kamloops. Knowing he would not be able to complete the work needed in the time given with the labor force he had, Onderdonk had at least 6.5 thousand Chinese workers brought in from China directly to work on the railway, though he did hire many more from California and the surrounding areas. Onderdonk was not the only contractor who helped import Chinese workers, but we will be focusing on his section due to its close relation to Kamloops. The work on the railway was already dangerous, with men working long shifts clearing brush, rubble, and laying heavy tracks. But for the Chinese men that Onderdonk had brought over, life on the railway was even more brutal. Chinese workers were segregated to separate camps away from the white workmen. They were paid much lower wages, the average white worker earning $1.5 to $2.5 a day, with provisions provided for them. On the other hand, Chinese men were paid around $1 a day and had to pay for their own gear and food. Their work was also much more dangerous. They often had to handle the nitroglycerin that was used for blasting. The conditions were harsh, and many men died of neglect and injury, with Chinese men not being able to access the company hospital like their white co-workers were. The actual numbers of death is unknown, but quoting Mabel Elmore, the Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives, it is estimated that 3 Chinese workers died for every mile of track laid. Chinese workers were unpopular with the other railmen, who feared lower wages and job loss to their Chinese counterparts. The BC government also disliked the use of Chinese workers, as they wanted white European men who would eventually settle afterwards. But men like Onderdonk and the owners of the CPR welcomed the Chinese workers, as they were seen as hardworking and well-behaved, but cheap and disposable as well. After the railway was completed, though, racist sentiments began to circulate more wildly, including within the government itself. While Chinese workers had been desirable for cheap labor, politicians did not see them as citizens. The so-called Yellow Peril was the term given to the influx of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, and it rapidly gained momentum, leading to the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885. This racist act, also known as the head tax, was a $50 tax levied on all Chinese immigrants entering Canada, eventually being raised up to $500. The fee did not discourage many people, though it did affect who was coming. Often men came alone, either already single or leaving behind their wives and children in order to send money home. Many who were already in Canada would not return, though some, as we will discuss, did, due to the cost. By 1890, Kamloops was on its way to a strong Chinese presence, with an estimated third of the population being Chinese men. Concentrated Chinese areas were established on the edges of town, approximately along the south bank of the Thompson River and near Kamloops' City Hall. Unfortunately, none of the buildings still remain today. It was never established as a Chinatown the same way that cities like Barkerville or Vancouver had, but was recognized by the townspeople. It was also home to the Chi Kuang Tong, a group also known as the Chinese Freemasons. Both a political movement and a benevolent society, the Chinese Freemasons in Kamloops acted as a support system for the single men who came to Canada, providing both economic and cultural support. They helped with lodging for young men just coming to Kamloops, organized festivals and events, and assisted with funerals. They provided an important social and cultural tether, as many of these men were isolated from the wider Canadian culture, through both racist sentiments, language barriers, and simply cultural differences. Though many of the Chinese men in Kamloops were often laborers or cooks, some became successful businessmen operating their own general stores and restaurants. Chan Ah-mi was one of these men. While the exact date of his arrival is lost to history, we know that Ah-mi was living in Kamloops by the late 1870s. By the 1890s, when Kamloops had officially become a city, with a small Chinatown developing on the West Victoria Street, he had a successful laundry business. Ah-mi reportedly was a practicing Christian, spoke good English, and wore Western clothing, making him more legitimized in the eyes of Kamloops' white community, though even he was not without scorn. But seemingly, Ah-mi used this prejudice to advertise his business. Newspapers from 1900 on sport advertisements from Ah-mi stating, "Have your washing done by Ah-mi, the whitest Chinese man in BC." Ah-mi is mentioned more than a few times within papers of his day, and was praised in 1893 for helping prevent the spread of a fire that had overtaken homes on West Victoria Street, remarking on his bravery. Another fact about Ah-mi, it was on one of his properties that the cabin of Jean-Baptiste Lolo was found. As we mentioned in episode 1, this cabin would go on to become the first museum in Kamloops. Another article about Ah-mi is entitled "A Chinese Wedding, the First Marriage of Celestials in Kamloops," and it talks about Ah-mi's wedding to his wife, Cherry Jip T He, in 1891. She was from Victoria and had traveled from the Chinese Methodist mission there. The article goes on to cover the wedding, remarking about the mix of English and Chinese culture. Both Cherry and Ah-mi are mentioned wearing traditional Chinese clothing, but were married in a Methodist ceremony. Only 8 other Chinese men attended, all Christians as well. It mentions that most of the Chinese people in town were seemingly uninterested, with only the Christian members celebrating the couple. This article is a prime example how Chinese people were viewed in Kamloops. People who had embraced Christianity, which was the default of European settlers, were seen in a more positive light, though they were still treated with a sense of otherness. Tragically, Ah-mi passed away after being struck by a vehicle in 1926. His funeral was not only attended by the Chinese community, but by the large number of the members of the white community who wished to pay their respects to the man who'd become incredibly well known in Kamloops. By most accounts, Chinese people in Kamloops were tolerated locally, though anti-Chinese sentiment was strongly felt across BC and Canada. White members of Kamloops remarked about enjoying the parades and fireworks that were put on, with one newspaper article about a celebration of the opening of the new Freemason Hall in 1911. It remarked on the different outfits, from Ah-mi wearing a more Western fit to traditional garb including dragon dancers, a traditional dance done during festivals to celebrate fortune and prosperity. The paper states a large crowd attended, including Indigenous people joining in on the celebration, watching the fireworks and inspecting the new building. The article was rife with racist comments and patronizing language, showing the view that white Canadians saw of their Chinese brethren. They might have enjoyed the celebration and spectacles, but they were still seen as lesser than the white settlers of the town. With Kamloops becoming more established, the need for cemeteries grew. While European settlers were typically buried in Pioneer Cemetery, which was built on the land of rancher John Peterson, Chinese men and women were not allowed to be buried there. The land that would become the Chinese cemetery was owned originally by the Hudson's Bay Company, who allowed the Chinese to bury their dead there. It was officially given to the Chinese in 1892, though the first public record of the cemetery comes from a Kamloops Sentinel article from 1897. Quote, "On rambling over the heights overlooking Kamloops, one of the reporters of the Centennial staff came upon a solitary grave," the article states. A reporter discovered a headboard bearing a Chinese inscription which indicated the body of a celestial was buried underneath. We have often wondered where the Chinese of Kamloops buried their dead, but this solitary grave upon the heights over which cattle tread seems to unravel much of the mystery. In the earliest days of the cemetery, burials were typically temporary, marked only by boards with a name written on it. The bodies would be exhumed after a few years and transported back to China, where they'd be reburied in their ancestral plots. It was in 1923 that this policy would change forever, with the implementation of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, otherwise known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. Since 1885, the head tax had been in place, but fueled by anti-Chinese sentiment, the BC government went farther, officially banning all Chinese immigrants from entering Canada, with a handful of exceptions like students, government workers, and merchants to name a few. Many people were unable to return to their families due to the cost, and now they're not able to sponsor family members to come over. Some men who were married could not afford to return home, and would never see their wives or children again. It almost immediately halted the growth of Chinese communities in BC and the wider Canada. The Racist Act would not be repealed until 1947. With the Exclusion Act in place, as well as growing world conflicts, the process of de-interring bones to return to China was impossible. The Chinese cemetery went from a temporary resting place to a permanent home. Fencing, cement pillars, incense burners, and an altar were all added to the cemetery, and it remained an active cemetery until 1976, when the last burial took place. 248 people are buried in the cemetery today. Plaques around the cemetery reveal their name, their ages, and their professions. Some of the earliest burials date back to 1891. Though many of them are men, we do see some of the earliest burials, including women and children. We don't know why they were not sent back to China, whether it was the cost, or whether they wanted to stay with their families who had come to Canada. We never will know why, but we do know where they rest today. The cemetery fell into some disrepair, with the city, in an attempt to clean up the area, removing many of the original grave markers in the late 1970s in error. It was restored by members of the Kamloops Chinese Freemason Association and the Chinese Cultural Association. The BC government, led by Premier Christy Clark, would officially apologize for the racist legislation enacted by past provincial governments in 2014. When I set out to create Maddog's Herstory, I knew that I had to recognize the impact and contributions of Chinese Canadians. So much of our province, of Kamloops itself, would not be here without the men and women who crossed an ocean to speak prosperity and a new life in Canada. But I also wanted people to know these stories. I myself knew some of the broader strokes of Chinese Canadians' history, but I did not know the role they played in the formation and shaping of Kamloops itself. The Herstory of Kamloops in BC simply cannot be told without them.